Hey there, and welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabrielle Nicolay, and I am delighted to be joined today by Kat Pendergast. Nope. Say your last name for me.
Pendergast.
Pendergast. Thank you. And Lacie, tell me your last name. Brueckner. Kat and Lacie, it is very lovely to have you on the show today to talk about death. But before we do that, tell the good people a little bit about who you are individually, why you collaborated on the book that we will talk about soon. Tell us a little bit about yourselves. Kat, you go first.
So I'm Catherine Pendergast, also known as Cat Socks. I've written under a pen name too, but I'm a children's author and I've written other books. And one day I was just visiting with Lacie. I also work in the funeral industry on the insurance side of things. And we were just visiting about the tools and resources for families that have kids during the funeral process. And there's just not a lot of them. And so we partnered together to create a set of books that would help children during the funeral process. And it also gets into some grieving mourning activities that they can do individually and as a family. But from there, we just had so many requests to do a pet version. And so that is where Goodbye Bella really came into existence. And we both had experienced so much loss in our own families with our animals that it was just really perfect timing. And so that's kind of how Lacie and I connected.
Lacie?
Yeah, my name's Lacie Brueckner and I'm a funeral director, and that's how I met Kat. And yeah, like she said, one day we got to talking. She was talking about her new book that she had written, and I said, there's not I don't think there's a whole lot for kids out there in regards to death and dying and grieving. And we started doing some digging and some research, didn't find a whole lot, and thought, maybe that's a gap that we can fill.
And it's so interesting. So your In Loving Memory series is about people dying and the funeral process. But this book that we're going to talk about today, Goodbye Bella, is about the death of a pet. And so what I love about that is what I love about pets dying. No, but the death of a pet is like a fantastic gateway. It's such a weird. There are very strange words that we use around death, and none of them are positive. So Lacie, maybe you can speak to that a little bit in a second, but it's a really good, solid gateway into death and dying. And so I find that really interesting. And so anyway, tell us more about the book. Tell us about how you're coming at this, given the dearth of material, number one, and then sensitive attitudes toward death and dying generally in our society.
Absolutely. I think a lot of us as adults and as parents, we're scared or nervous, not only to talk about death amongst each other, but to talk about death and dying to our children. And that's kind of where these books kind of help with that. Is it's a story form for a child and kind of walks them through what they might see, what they might experience. And the pet version, Goodbye Bella, is a great introductory. A lot of us have pets. A lot of times for a child, the loss of a pet is their first loss that they might experience too.
Yeah. What age group, before we go any further, is this book directed at, would you say?
So it's about for age 4 to 10 is, kind of the target, but it could be for other ages too, if you feel you want to read it to a younger group or an older group too. Kind of one of the surprising things that has happened along the ways is how many people have reached out to us and said that the books has helped them as adults. And we weren't really expecting that. So I don't know if the age limit really pertains.
I love that. And that's so indicative of where we're at in terms of a society, in terms of conversations that are not had around death and dying. And most of us, I think, probably handle it pretty well, better. Maybe. I don't know, Lacie, do you see movement in this, like in just the conversation people are able to have? Or
yeah, and that's one thing I encourage too, is and let people know, give yourself permission. It's okay to talk about it. It's okay to talk about death. The reality of it, we're all going to experience it at some point. We can't get away from that. So it's okay to remove the fear from it. It's okay to have that conversation. It's okay to use death and dying words to children. Give death the proper name. I always say it's so important to don't tell a child that, oh, they're just sleeping. They're just sleeping. Death is separate from sleeping, and we want to identify it as so. That makes sense.
That is, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, for anybody who hasn't already listened to the interview with Martha Adler, who's my social worker friend, we did a whole episode on death and dying, and that is like one of the first things she says is call it by its name. Grandma didn't they haven't passed on, they haven't gone to sleep for a long time. Like the last thing we want to do is pair death and sleeping, because we need our kids to sleep.
Exactly.
So if people are interested in more on this topic, they can check that one out. So set it up for us. Like, is Bella based on a particular pet of yours? Like, how did you create this story?
So I had 2 Great Danes. One was, her name was Carmela. She was a certified pet therapy dog. So I volunteered in the community at a facility where kids lived, and she just loved doing that. We did that most of her life, and the kids just loved her. And so a lot of the book is in her likeness, the character, I guess, Bella. And in the story, the little girl, she has Bella, and she knows that Bella is getting older, and they find out that Bella's just not going to be around much longer. She, has some kind of illness and is going to be dying. And so she's afraid that she's not going to get to say goodbye to Bella, because she doesn't really know when Bella's going to die. And so she comes up with a pretty unique way of saying goodbye to Bella. And she does that every day, and makes sure that she gets to say goodbye every day, and kind of enjoy those last moments, even though some of them are really hard, because she's getting towards the end of life, where end of life things are happening, having accidents, not wanting to eat, not being as playful. And so you kind of get to see some of that emotion come out around grieving the loss of kind of their youth in some way. And then they end up, when Bella passes away, they have a celebration of life for her. And then eventually down the road, they end up adopting a new dog. And so kind of showing that it's okay to love again.
So this is so interesting, because as you were talking about the emotions that come up, I think parents in particular, as regards maybe even their own emotions, but certainly negative emotions of their children. Like, we want to, as parents often, and many of the parents who listen to this podcast have children who are neurodivergent in some way, so they're a bit complicated emotionally anyway. We want to buffer, we want to protect from feelings. And what we know from the literature, certainly neuroscience and teaching and psychology and lots of other sources, and it sounds like this is what you're alluding to here too, is like, if we don't deal with feelings, they come back another way. And so even with something, and Lacie, maybe you can speak to this, even with something as complicated as death, and you see this all the time in your work, like, there is no other way. One of my favorite books is, got it right here, We're Going on a Bear Hunt. Can't go over it, can't go under it, can't go around it, got to go through it. What do you think about that, Lacie?
Oh, absolutely. Very true. Very, very true. So, it's best to give those emotions a name. It's best to address them. It's best to, let your child know that it's okay. So we had an incident recently. So our little Yorkie, Layla, died about a year ago. And about 3 months ago or so, we adopted a new dog. And my little 11-year-old, out of the blue, just started feeling guilty. And I told her, hon, it's okay to feel guilty. It's okay, but just know we have enough love in our hearts. She was afraid that if she loved our new dog, it would be not honoring Layla. And I said, honey, Layla's not here anymore. We can't help that. Layla died, and our lives are still here, and we go on, and we can give a new dog a home, and we have lots of love in our hearts to do that. So, yeah.
But it is this, like, it's so lucky that your daughter has your perspective there. And I think there is often some work on the part of the adults to reconcile this emotion, particularly if they've experienced the death of a pet or a family member, or somebody who was close to them that wasn't handled in this way, where it wasn't okay to grieve, and where we were made to feel guilty, or that we did that to ourselves, because Lord knows children do that to themselves all the time, right? And so how wonderful, and then how necessary also, that the adults are able to signal to the kids, this is normal. And there's an expression in the field that we talk about: name it to tame it. Right? If something has a name, then it is not so awful that it can't even be named. Like if we can name it, then it's like, oh, that's what that is. Okay, next. When you were writing the book, Kat, I asked you this before, you are not an illustrator, correct?
No.
And you were talking about the pictures, though, like you had a specific mood that you wanted for this.
Yeah, we had an amazing illustrator do all three of the memory books or lost books, death books, however you want to label it. But she just did an outstanding job on capturing, I feel like, the right amount of sadness, but not in a scary way. And so with the funeral ones, we actually have grandma in the casket, because that's a really important conversation to have if the child is going to be viewing the body. Grandma's going to look a little bit different in the casket than she did in real life, and she's no longer alive. And so there could be some differences. So that's an important conversation to have. And Goodbye Bella is, I would say, a little bit sadder in the illustrations. But also our kids are probably living with the pets and have a different attachment, possibly, where they're seeing them every day. And so they might even experience a little bit more sadness of the pet versus maybe somebody that they don't know quite as well that they're attending the funeral for. Obviously, if it's a really close family member, that might be different, but your first funeral might be a great grandparent or a distant relative that you might not know as well.
Yeah, no, and it's certainly true that, right, pets are often the first point of contact. What has the response been to this book?
So it's just been an amazing how much feedback we've received on all the books, really, and how much they've helped everyone. We've had a lot of people reach out about really tragic events that have happened, and how the book has really bridged a gap in a community where maybe like a child has died, or a parent has died, and some of those really difficult deaths where a lot of kids are going to a funeral for the first time at a young age. I just had one where it was a teacher that had died, and all of I think it was like a third grade class or second grade class, everyone was attending. So just amazing how many families we've been able to help. And even on the pet version, it hasn't been out that long, but we've received just wonderful feedback on that too.
Yeah. It's so interesting. There's a term in special education literature called a social narrative, which is basically a step-by-step primer on a social situation. It could be an airplane flight. It could be going to school for the first time, going on a field trip, coming into your house after school. It strikes me that this is a story equivalent of a social narrative, where you're really laying out in what calm detail what might be happening, and how people might be feeling. And again, that naming what's happening in advance for people, so that when they go through the experience, for kids in particular, when they go through that experience, it's familiar to them.
Yeah, we actually kind of even took that a step further in not only identifying those emotions, but then taking action after. Okay, I'm really feeling sad. I'm really missing my dog. And my son just did this a couple weeks ago, where he said, "Man, Mom, I'm really missing Carmela and Meadow, and I'm just really sad." And so we took a moment and said, "Hey, would you want to go back and look through some videos and some photos of them and share some silly stories, some funny stories that he wouldn't remember as a child, as a young child, I guess, when they were still puppies and stuff like that." So I think acknowledging that, but then also trying to do something about it to honor them, remember them. And for me in my personal life, when my mom died, I took care of her as she was dying when I was about 21, 22 years old. And, that was just a really hard death, obviously, for me. But one of the most therapeutic things I've ever done is every Mother's Day I plant flowers for her. And it has so much meaning to me, because that was the last activity we really got to do together, was have Mother's Day. We planted flowers, we went out for ice cream. And so that's like just an important way for me to honor and remember my mom, even though it's so simple. And so we've had a lot of feedback on just a simple idea. Maybe on Grandpa's birthday, we still bake him his favorite cake. Or maybe they were known for doing something important on Christmas and you still leave a chair for them. Or maybe you all watch the same movie on Christmas that you always did. And that's kind of this honoring and remembering that person. And so encourage people to do those things, because
Yeah.
I think it's really helped me.
Did that. My father died quite suddenly about 12 years ago. And for years after that, and it felt very important for the first, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years. And it's fallen off a little bit. We, on his birthday, made his favorite meal, his birthday cake. It was like this crazy special cake that, is the cake. And yeah, we turned it into a little birthday party for Grandpa. And before we hit record, Kat, you said something really interesting, which is about your son getting to know your mother. So talk a little bit about that, because I love that.
Yeah. And, because my mom was quite young, she was 56 when she died, and I was pretty young too. So I didn't have kids yet. But my son always knew that about my mom, and that she was sick and she died and she had cancer and things like that, but he never got to meet her. So he's always asked a lot of questions, and I always try to answer those, talk about my mom, so that he can get to know her, even though he's never truly met her. And one of the things that surprised me when we first came out with the human version, I guess, of the book, was I read it to him, and we hadn't really experienced a loss in the family, but we read it and he goes, Mom, I'm really sorry that your mom died. I wish I could have met her. And I was like, wow, that showed some empathy that he kind of learned through the books. And he's always kind of at that time was struggling with what is real, what's not, because in video games, on TV, when people die, it's just different. And now it's this real life thing that we're talking about.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I just want to, Lacie, is there anything that you find yourself repeating to parents or families in your line of work?
Yeah, I would say, I definitely, and we get asked a lot if kids should attend a funeral, or should we talk to kids about death and that sort of thing. And I've always, of course, with my kids, they've grown up with it. I've always been in the business since, they've been little, but so we're pretty open about death and dying conversations. But I tell people, a lot of times kids can handle more sometimes than what we give them credit for. They understand more, and they're satisfied with simple answers. So if they ask a question, give them a simple answer to start. If they want to know more, they'll ask more. But sometimes just that simple answer is satisfactory to them. So, that's okay. But just have that conversation. It's okay to talk about it.
I love that. Answer the question that is asked and no more.
Yeah, because we feel the need to over explain a lot of times. And with the kid, they're looking at you to start this big long explanation, and they're like, what? They were happy with that first 3 words you said.
Right. That's not what I asked you at all. Where are they going
Right.
to go? In the ground. Okay. And actually, that's so interesting what you just said. And then you mentioned this, I think your 11-year-old was feeling guilty, and which didn't happen until much later in the process. So this notion, I think, Kat, you mentioned this before we hit record too, that there is no timeline for this, and it's not linear. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, Lacie?
Yeah, absolutely not linear at all. And there is no timeline. So just when you think that you're doing okay and things are good, you might hit a speed bump, and you might have a rocky patch, and memories might pop up and different emotions might pop up that you maybe didn't have before. But that's grief.
Yeah. Kat, anything to add?
Yeah, I think sometimes, like we just talked about earlier, at the holidays, the birthdays, the anniversaries of their death or other anniversaries, those are almost like trigger dates that bring on that grief possibly. And some years might be better than others, but yeah, you kind of have the grief in waves that come and go, and it's okay to have a hard day, for sure. But I think keeping that conversation open with our kids and letting them kind of lead that conversation and let them lead in how involved they want to be in different activities too is something that we Lacie and I both try to do.
They're ready for more than we think often. If people want to find the book, or give us the title again, tell us all the places where people can find this lovely book.
Yeah, so Goodbye Bella is a pet loss story, and it is available on Amazon. It's also available on my website, catsocks.com, and any book retailer out there, it is also available there.
Fantastic. Lacie, if people want to learn more about like what you do, can they find you?
Not so much. I got called an enigma the other day on one podcast we did. But yeah, mostly for our books and for everything, you'll want to go through Kat Socks. Definitely.
Perfect. And can you spell Kat Socks for us, please?
So it's KATSSOCKS.com.
Okay, like actual socks that go on your feet.
Yeah. So my business, I started out making little baby booties, and that name was Kat Socks. And with my whole business, I donate a portion of sales to animal shelters. And so I incorporated animals into what I was doing, and it evolved into all of these books about a dog named Pickles, and just all kinds of crazy things that ended up happening. And that's where the pen name Kat Socks came from. But yeah, so it's kind of a long story on where that all came from.
Well, it sounds like you've got many more delightful books on different topics available, so people will want to check that out, and we'll link to all of that in the show notes. In the meantime, thank you both so much for being here. This was really, I think, an important conversation and also an enjoyable one. So thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you very much for having us.